It is the morning of December 16, 1944. Across a frozen pine wood in the Ardennes, German soldiers of the newly raised Volksgrenadier divisions wait for the order to advance. They grip the wooden stocks of Karabiner 98K rifles, the same bolt-action weapons their fathers carried in the trenches of the First World War. Across the line, hidden behind low stone walls and snow-heaped fences, American privates rest their cheeks against the walnut stocks of M1 Garands. Each Garand holds 8 rounds. Each rifleman carries a bandolier of clips on his chest. When the firefight begins, the German must work his bolt by hand, lifting, pulling, pushing, locking, for every single shot. The American pulls the trigger 8 times as fast as he can squeeze it. By the time the German rifleman has chambered his 5th round, the American has emptied his rifle, slammed in a fresh clip, and started again. This is the story of a difference so large that German soldiers refused to believe it at first. They thought the Americans must be carrying machine guns. They thought every squad must have an automatic weapon hidden behind every tree. The truth was stranger and far more humbling. The Americans were carrying ordinary infantry rifles. They had simply built a rifle that fired faster than anything Germany had ever issued in numbers. And while Germany juggled dozens of different weapons, in dozens of different calibers, scavenged from half the countries of Europe, America had done something almost no one expected. America had standardized. America had simplified. America had made a small, tight family of weapons, and then it had built them by the millions. By the end of the war, the United States had produced more than 4 million M1 Garands. Germany had produced about 400,000 semi-automatic rifles in total, spread across 2 failed designs and 1 rushed wartime program. The contrast was not subtle, it was crushing. And when German veterans sat down after the war to write their memoirs, the same theme came back again and again. The volume of American small arms fire was unlike anything they had trained for. It was not the heroism of the GI that surprised them, it was the math. To understand the shock, you have to understand the rifle that caused it. The M1 Garand was the work of a quiet, modest man named John Cantius Garand. He was born in Saint-Rémy, Quebec, on January 1st, 1888, and his family moved to Jewett City, Connecticut around the time he was 11. He was a self-taught machinist with the kind of mind that took clockwork apart and put it back together better than the factory had made it. As a teenager, he learned machining in the textile mills of Jewett City. He then worked in precision tool factories in Providence, Rhode Island, and in New York City. He held early patents on a screwjack and a bobbin winding machine before he ever touched a rifle design. In 1917, he submitted a light machine gun design to the United States military that earned him a post at the Bureau of Standards in Washington. On November 4, 1919, he transferred to the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the historic heart of American small arms development, as a consulting engineer. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1920. He would spend the rest of his working life inside that armory, and he would change the way infantry fought. Garand worked on his rifle design for nearly 2 decades. He patented the rifle in 1932. The Army cleared the rifle for procurement on November 7, 1935, and standardized it as the U.S. rifle caliber 30, M1, on January 9, 1936. The first production rifle was proof-fired and accuracy tested on July 21, 1937. Production at Springfield began that September at 10 rifles a day. By January 1940, the line was producing 100 a day. By January 1942, more than 1,100. And in January 1944, in a single 31-day month, Springfield Armory rolled 122,001 M1 Garands out the door. That is more than 3,900 rifles a day. That is more, in 1 month, than the entire wartime production of every German semi-automatic rifle program combined. What made the rifle so revolutionary was not just that it fired 1 shot per trigger pull without working a bolt. The Soviets had a semi-automatic rifle. The Germans had tried, and failed, to build one. What made the M1 different was that it worked. It worked in mud. It worked in sand. It worked in the freezing cold of the Ardennes and the soaking heat of the Pacific. It chambered the same powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge that American machine guns and sniper rifles already used. It loaded with an 8-round en-bloc clip that snapped in from the top in a single motion. A trained rifleman could fire 20 to 30 aimed shots a minute, far more than any bolt-action rifle could match. A German rifleman with a Karabiner 98K, working as fast as he safely could, would manage 10 to 15. There is a moment in 1932 that almost cost the M1 its place in history. The army was on the verge of adopting a smaller .276 caliber version of the Garand. It would have given the rifle a bigger magazine and lighter ammunition. But the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, looked at the warehouses full of standard .30 caliber ammunition the United States had stockpiled since the First World War, and he said no. On February 25, 1932, the Adjutant General, acting for the Secretary of War, ordered all work on the smaller cartridge to cease. The decision was MacArthur's. Because of that decision, the M1 was a .30-06 rifle. It hit hard. It used the same bullet as every other major American small arm. And when American soldiers fought across 2 oceans, they could feed any .30 caliber weapon in their squad from the same crates of ammunition. While Garand was perfecting his rifle in Massachusetts, Germany was preparing for a different war with a different philosophy. The Wehrmacht's standard rifle was the Karabiner 98K, officially adopted on June 21, 1935. It was a refinement of the Mauser Gewehr 98, the rifle that had served the Kaiser's army in the First World War. The action dated back to the 1890s. The cartridge was the 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser, sometimes called the 8 mm Mauser. The internal magazine held 5 rounds, fed by stripper clips. The bolt was strong, the rifle was accurate, and German soldiers loved it for what it was. It was, by almost any measure, the finest combat bolt-action rifle of its generation. The wood was good. The steel was good. The trigger was crisp. At 500 meters, in trained hands, it could put round after round into a man-sized target. There is even an irony of history in the design lineage. The American M1 1903 Springfield, the rifle the Garand replaced, was so close to the Mauser action that the United States government quietly negotiated to pay royalties to the Mauser firm in the early 1900s, around $200,000 in total before payments stopped on America's entry into the First World War. The trouble was simply that the 98K was a bolt-action rifle, in a war where bolt-action rifles were becoming obsolete. Every shot required the soldier to break aim, lift the bolt handle, draw it back, push it forward, lock it down, and reacquire the target. Each cycle took about 2 seconds, even for a fast, well-trained man. By the time the German rifleman had fired his 5 rounds, he had to thumb in another stripper clip from a leather pouch on his belt. By any honest measure, his rate of fire was a third or less of the American beside whom he was fighting. Germany made roughly 14 million Karabiner 98K rifles between 1934 and May 1945. 14 million. The number sounds enormous, and it is, but it is also misleading. Those 14 million rifles were spread across a Wehrmacht that fought on every front from Norway to North Africa to the suburbs of Moscow, and they had to be supplemented by an astonishing collection of foreign weapons captured from defeated enemies. The German Army Weapons Office catalogued this hoard in a 14-volume directory called the Fremdgerät, a polite German word that translates roughly as foreign equipment. By the end of 1944, Germany had captured more than 11 million rifles from other nations. Czech Mausers from the factories at Brno, Polish rifles from 1939, French Lebels and Berthiers from 1940, Soviet Mosin Nagants by the million from the Eastern Front, Italian Carcanos in their own peculiar caliber after the Italian surrender, British Lee Enfields scooped up at Dunkirk and used as far away as Yugoslavia. Each of these foreign rifles got its own German designation, with a country code letter tucked next to the model number. Belgian rifles became the model with a B, French rifles got an F, Russian rifles got an R, Polish rifles got a P, Italian rifles got an I. The system was efficient on paper. In practice, it was a logistical nightmare. Each foreign rifle used its own foreign cartridge. Each cartridge had to be manufactured, distributed, and matched to the right unit, by a Reich whose railroads were being bombed to ruins. The Italian Carcano became, by some accounts, the most numerous foreign rifle issued to last-ditch German formations in 1945. A small farming district in northern Bavaria, in November 1944, drew up a weapons inventory for its local defense unit. It listed 21 Gewehr 98s, 15 Karabiner 98Ks, 42 Italian rifles, 44 French rifles, 1 Romanian rifle, 19 civilian hunting rifles, and 81 shotguns. That was the arsenal of a German town in the last winter of the war. Compare that to the United States. The American infantryman in Europe in 1944 carried weapons from a strikingly small family. The M1 Garand fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge. The M1 1903 Springfield, used as a sniper rifle and a rifle grenade launcher, fired the same .30-06. The M1 1918, a 2 Browning automatic rifle, the squad's automatic weapon, fired the same .30-06. The M1 1919 A4 Browning machine gun, mounted on a tripod or a jeep, fired the same .30-06. The M1 1917 A1 heavy machine gun on a water-cooled tripod fired the same .30-06, 1 cartridge, 5 major weapons, all of them shooting from the same olive-drab ammunition cans. The M1 carbine and the M1 Thompson submachine gun used different cartridges, the .30 carbine and the .45 ACP, but those too were shared across multiple weapons. The M3 submachine gun, the so-called grease gun, fired the same .45 ACP as the Thompson and the M1911A1 pistol. The whole American small arms system was designed so that the same crate of bullets could feed several different weapons. The American family was small enough to count on one hand for primary weapons, the M1 Garand for the infantry rifleman, the M1 carbine for officers, NCOs, drivers, signalers and crews, the M1 1903 Springfield for snipers and grenadiers, the Thompson and the grease gun for close quarters fighting, the Browning automatic rifle for squad fire support, the Browning 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns for sustained fire. That was, very nearly, the whole story. The German list, by contrast, ran across pages. The Browning automatic rifle deserves a moment of its own. Designed by John Moses Browning during the First World War, it had been intended to give American soldiers a way to advance across no man's land while firing from the hip. By the Second World War, the M1 1918, a 2 version, had become the squad's heart. It weighed about 19 pounds with its bipod, fired the same .30-06 round as the Garand, and could deliver fully automatic fire from a 20-round magazine. Wartime production figures vary by source from roughly 188,000 to over 200,000 units, built primarily by New England Small Arms and IBM. Every American rifle squad of 1944 had at least one BAR man, and that automatic weapon was fed from the same ammunition pouches as everyone else's Garand. The M1 1903 Springfield rifle, the Garand's older brother, also kept fighting through the war. Bolt action, 5-round magazine, accurate at long range. It served as the standard American rifle from 1903 through the early years of the Second World War. When Garand production lagged, 2 civilian factories restarted M1 production. Remington Arms produced more than 1 million M1 1903 rifles between 1941 and 1944. Smith Corona, a typewriter company, produced roughly 234,000 M1 1903, 3 rifles, between October 1942 and February 1944. The M1 1903, a 4 variant, became the standard American sniper rifle from 1943 onward. So the picture of an entirely Garand-armed American army is incomplete. The bolt-action Springfield kept fighting beside the semi-automatic Garand to the end of the war. The American answer to mass production was just as decisive as the design itself. Springfield Armory was the principal builder of the M1, but in 1939, the United States gave Winchester Repeating Arms a so-called educational order, a small contract for 500 rifles, intended only to teach Winchester how to build them. By the end of the war, Winchester had delivered 513,880 M1 Garands. Springfield delivered 3,526,922 during the war years. Combined wartime production, just 1941 to 1945, came to 4,040,800, 2 Mastra, 1 Garands. By the time production finally ended in the 1950s, more than 5.4 million had been built by Springfield, Winchester, and two post-war contractors, Harrington and Richardson, and International Harvester. The unit cost fell as production scaled up. Early war Garands cost the government roughly $80 apiece. By 1945, with assembly lines running flat out, the cost per rifle had dropped to about $30. About $30 for the most advanced infantry rifle in the world. Garand himself never received a penny in royalties. He had assigned all rights to the United States government in January 1936. A bill in Congress to award him $100,000 in recognition of his service died in committee. He kept working at Springfield Armory until his retirement in April 1953. As a retirement gift, the Secretary of the Army personally presented him with the 1 millionth Garand made at Springfield. He was inducted into the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame in 1973. He died on February 16, 1974, in Springfield, Massachusetts. The M1 carbine was a separate weapon and a separate program. Issued from 1942 onward, the carbine was a light, handy rifle in a low-powered 30-caliber pistol-style cartridge. It was meant for soldiers whose primary job was something other than rifle combat. It became, by any measure, the most produced American small arm of the entire war. More than 6 million M1 carbines were built between 1942 and 1945. The contractors who produced them tell the story of American mobilization. General Motors' Inland Division built more than 2.5 million. Winchester built over 800,000. Underwood Elliott Fisher, a typewriter company, built more than 540,000. The Saginaw Steering Gear Division of General Motors built more than 500,000. National Postal Meter built over 400,000. Quality Hardware and Machine built nearly 360,000. International Business Machines, the office equipment company that would later build the world's first commercial computers, built over 340,000 carbines. The Rock-Ola Manufacturing Corporation, famous for its jukeboxes, built more than 228,000. This was the American war machine. Companies that had built typewriters and office calendars and cash registers 6 months earlier were now stamping out infantry weapons faster than European factories could imagine. While American factories were settling into a rhythm that produced more than 100,000 M1s a month, German engineers were trying, and mostly failing, to catch up. The first attempt was the Gewehr 41, fielded in two competing versions, one by Walther and one by Mauser. The German military had imposed a strange and self-defeating requirement on both designers. The rifle could not have a gas port drilled into the barrel, because the engineers feared that fouling and corrosion would ruin the gas system. So both designs used a clumsy muzzle trap that captured propellant gas at the front of the barrel and pushed an operating rod backward. The Mauser version, the Gewehr 41M, was a disaster. Only 6,673 were made, and 1,673 of them were returned to the depot as unusable. The Walther version, the Gewehr 41W, was better, but still fouled badly in the field. Production estimates run from 40,000 to 145,000 rifles, depending on the source. In 1943, after Germans on the Eastern Front were faced with Soviet VT-40 semi-automatic rifles in mass numbers, Walther redesigned the rifle around a captured Soviet gas system. The result was the Gewehr 43, later renamed the Karabiner 43. It used a 10-round detachable box magazine. It actually worked. Production began in October 1943. Total wartime output, including more than 53,000 sniper variants, came to 402,713 rifles. The plan was to issue 19 of them to every German infantry company. The plan was never fully achieved. Many of those rifles were built by slave laborers at the Buchenwald concentration camp under the Gustloff-Werke contractor system, and at the Neuengamme camp for the Berlin-Lübecker firm. Allied bombing in 1944 severely damaged Gustloff production, and total Gustloff output of the rifle remained well under 50,000 units. Then there was the rifle that should have changed everything. In 1942, German engineers under Hugo Schmeisser at the Haenel firm completed the first prototypes of a radically new weapon. It fired an intermediate cartridge, the 7.9 2x33mm Kurz, smaller and shorter than the standard Mauser round. It was select fire, capable of fully automatic bursts as well as single shots. It used a 30-round detachable box magazine. It was, in every way that mattered, the world's first true assault rifle. Hitler initially opposed it. He was furious about the logistics burden of a brand new cartridge, with vast stocks of standard German ammunition already on hand. To get around the Führer's veto, the army renamed the rifle the MP-43, pretending it was simply an upgraded submachine gun. Reports from Eastern Front units that received early production examples were enthusiastic. Hitler eventually relented. The rifle was renamed the MP-44. Then, in October 1944, it received its final, theatrical name, the Sturmgewehr 44. The word means storm rifle, or assault rifle. The new name was largely a propaganda decision. The Sturmgewehr was a brilliant weapon. It was also, by the time it reached real numbers, far too late. Total wartime production of all variants came to 425,977 rifles. Almost all of them went to the Eastern Front and to Volksgrenadier divisions in the final months of the war. By comparison, American factories produced more than 6 million M1 carbines alone, more than 4 million M1 Garands, and more than 1 million Thompson submachine guns. For every German Sturmgewehr that left the factory, 10 M1 Garands rolled off American lines. For every German semi-automatic rifle of any kind, the figure was closer to 10-1 as well, and if the comparison includes all American semi-automatic and automatic weapons, the ratio rises sharply higher. By the autumn of 1944, the German weapons situation had become surreal. Hitler ordered the creation of the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, a national militia of every able-bodied male between 16 and 60. The plan was to put millions of new defenders on the streets of German cities and to arm them. There were not enough rifles. By late January 1945, the Volkssturm had managed to accumulate only about 40,500 rifles for its entire force. To fill the gap, German factories built, simplified, last-ditch weapons known as Volkssturmgewehrs. These were stamped, crude rifles thrown together from whatever steel could be found. The Gustloff-Werke produced about 10,000 of one such rifle, designated VG1 through 5, depending on the variant. The sights were fixed at 100 meters. At 300 meters, the bullets dropped almost a full meter, missing the target completely. These rifles never received the official German weapons inspection stamp. They were issued by political officials at the district level and handed to teenagers and old men. That was the rifle Germany was building in the spring of 1945, while America was still rolling out finished M1 Garands by the thousands every day. Why did Germany fall so far behind? Part of the answer is industrial. The Reich never had America's raw materials, never had America's untouched factories, and never had the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean shielding its production lines from enemy bombers. Part of the answer is political. Hitler personally meddled with weapons procurement again and again, killing programs and reviving them on whim. Part of the answer is doctrinal, and this is the deepest and most surprising part of the story. The German army had genuinely decided that the rifle was not the most important weapon in the squad. In American doctrine, the rifleman was the basic unit of firepower. The squad existed to put riflemen on the battlefield. The Browning automatic rifle supported the rifleman. In German doctrine, it was the other way around. The squad existed to feed and protect a single belt-fed machine gun. The rifleman carried the gunner's spare barrels, the ammunition belts, and the tripod. The rifle was a personal weapon, almost a backup. The center of mass of a German squad was the MG-34, or, after 1942, the MG-42. A standard 10-man German squad consisted of the squad leader with a submachine gun, an assistant leader with a rifle, the machine gunner with the MG-34 or MG-42, and a pistol, an assistant gunner with a pistol, an ammunition carrier with a rifle, and 5 riflemen with Karabiner 98Ks. By 1944, doctrine allowed for 2 Gewehr 43s per squad, and where available, Sturmgewehrs. The MG-42 was, on its own terms, a terrifying weapon. It fired between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute. The sound it made was unlike anything else on the battlefield. American GIs called it Hitler's buzzsaw. Germans called it the Knochensage, the bone saw, or simply Hitler sage, Hitler's saw. The Soviets called it the Linoleum Ripper. The German rifle squad was built around the gun, with substantial belts of ammunition carried by assistants. A 1944 pattern German infantry company had more than a dozen MG-42s served by their own crews and supporting riflemen. By contrast, an American rifle company at the same date had only 2 Browning M1 1919A, 4 light machine guns at the company level. So at first glance, German doctrine looks heavier. A dozen high cyclic rate machine guns per company against 2 American light machine guns. But that comparison is misleading, because it ignores the rifles in the hands of every other man. Every American in a rifle company who was not crewing a heavy weapon was carrying an M1 Garand or a Browning automatic rifle. When the company opened fire, 200 riflemen with Garands could put 20 to 30 aimed shots per minute downrange, each. The math, multiplied across a battalion, produced volumes of small arms fire that German soldiers had simply never been trained to expect. American doctrine countered the German machine gun heavy squad with a wave of accurate semi-automatic fire from every man. This is the heart of why Wehrmacht veterans wrote, again and again, that American firepower felt like the work of an army of machine gunners. The colorful internet phrase that German prisoners reported every American having a machine gun has no single primary source that can be tied to a named soldier and a verified date. It should not be repeated as a direct quotation, but the underlying perception is well documented in post-war German memoirs and in surviving German interrogation reports. Hans von Luck, a Knight's Cross holder of the 21st Panzer Division, described in his memoir Panzer Commander the experience of fighting Americans in late 1944 and early 1945. His account dwells at length on the overwhelming volume of Allied artillery, air power, and small arms fire. He does not single out the Garand by name, but the cumulative impression he leaves is unmistakable. American infantry produced fire of a density that the Wehrmacht had not seen on the Western Front before. The first time American soldiers fired Garands at Germans in large numbers was Operation Torch, the Allied landings in North Africa, on November 8, 1942. Many American units in those early campaigns were still equipped with the bolt-action M1 1903, Springfield, the Garand's predecessor. The transition to full Garand issue across the United States Army took until early 1943. The Marine Corps officially approved the M1 Garand for issue to all Marine combat units on June 26, 1942, just a few weeks after the Battle of Midway. The first Marine Garand combat use came earlier, with the 6th Marine Defense Battalion, during the bombardment of Midway Island on June 4, 1942. On Guadalcanal, in August 1942, the rifle companies of the 1st Marine Division landed largely armed with M1 1903 Springfields. The Army's 164th Infantry Regiment, originally the North Dakota National Guard, came ashore on October 13, 1942, with full Garand equipment. The Marines fighting alongside them noticed the difference immediately. Many Marines simply took Garands from wounded and killed soldiers and never gave them back. The 3rd Marine Division, activated in September 1942, was the 1st Marine Division fully equipped with the M1, with the equipping completed during late 1942 and early 1943 training, by the Italian campaign in 1943, by Normandy on June 6, 1944, by the breakout in August, by the Hurtgen Forest in the autumn, by the snow-blasted nightmare of the Ardennes that December. The M1 Garand was the universal American battle rifle in Europe. In Hurtgen Forest, where the fighting was at ranges of 50 yards and less among dense pines, where companies were fed into the meat grinder and consumed in days, battlefield archaeologists today still recover, spent 8-round Garand clips by the thousands. The 28th Infantry Division, known as the Bloody Bucket, the 4th Infantry Division, the 8th, the 9th, and the 78th, all fought through that forest with the rifle. In Aachen, in October 1944, in the bombed-out streets of the first major German city to fall, GIs of the 1st Infantry Division cleared house after house with the rifle. In the Battle of the Bulge, photographs in the National Archives show Private First Class Frank Vukasin of Great Falls, Montana, of the 331st Infantry Regiment, 83rd Division, stopping to load a fresh clip into his Garand while advancing through the snow at Houffalize, Belgium, on January 15, 1945. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne, the 28th, 99th, and 106th Infantry Divisions all fought through the snow with the Garand as their primary weapon. The senior American commander who became most famously associated with the rifle was Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. On January 26, 1945, Patton sat down on 3rd United States Army letterhead and wrote a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., the Chief of Ordnance of the War Department. The letter is preserved in the United States National Records, and it begins with a single famous sentence. In his opinion, Patton wrote, "The M1 rifle was the greatest battle implement ever devised." He went on to say that his admiration for ordnance products did not stop with the M1. The American machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks, he wrote, were without equal. He praised his soldiers as unconquerable veterans. The phrase, "the greatest battle implement ever devised," has been quoted ever since. Patton was not the only American officer to put his admiration on paper. In a letter of instruction, No. 2, dated April 3, 1944, Patton circulated tactical guidance to his corps and division commanders, quoting Admiral David Farragut, that the best armor was a rapid and well-directed fire, and applying that principle to the volume of fire the M1 Garand made possible. Field manuals from 1943 onward replaced their illustrations of the older bolt action with the new semi-automatic. Lieutenant Colonel John B. George, an officer of the United States Army's 132nd Infantry Regiment, Americal Division, who carried a Garand on Guadalcanal, wrote in his 1947 book Shots Fired in Anger that the rifle was probably the best in the war and the best military hand weapon ever placed on a battlefield. That was the verdict of a man who had used it in close combat against the Japanese. Winchester later produced a special presentation Garand for Patton, with chrome-plated metal and a presentation walnut stock. He died from injuries sustained in a vehicle accident on December 21, 1945, before the rifle could be delivered to him. That presentation rifle is preserved today at the Cody Firearms Museum in Cody, Wyoming. A few myths grew around the rifle that need to be addressed honestly. The most famous is the so-called Garand ping. The 8-round en bloc clip, when the last shot is fired, ejects out of the top of the rifle with a distinctive metallic ping. The story is that German soldiers learned to listen for that ping and then rush forward to attack the American while he was reloading. Some accounts add that GIs threw empty clips against rocks to fake the sound and lure Germans into the open. There is no documented combat case of a German soldier killing an American because of the ping. The respected M1 historian Bruce Canfield, author of the standard reference work on the rifle, has called the claim too silly to be worthy of serious discussion. Combat noise on a real battlefield, between rifle reports, machine gun bursts, mortar fire and shouting, would have drowned out the small metallic sound of an ejected clip at any meaningful distance. Some American veterans interviewed after the Korean War even said the ping helped them, telling them their rifle was empty at exactly the moment they needed to know. The story belongs in the category of folklore, repeated so often that it became a kind of truth. It should be retired. A second myth is closer to the truth. The famous statement of the post-war military historian S.L.A. Marshall that only 15 to 25% of American infantrymen actually fired their rifles in any given engagement has been comprehensively rebutted by later researchers. The historian Roger J. Spiller, writing in the Royal United Services Institution Journal in 1988, traced Marshall's interview claims and showed that his data were essentially fabricated. The journalist Frederick Smoller published a full debunking in American Heritage magazine in March 1989. The point matters because, for decades, the Marshall claim was used to argue that the Garand's firepower advantage was theoretical. It was not theoretical. American soldiers used their rifles, and they used them often. A third clarification matters. Not every American soldier in the Second World War carried a Garand. The M1 carbine was issued to officers, NCOs, signalers, drivers, mortar crews, and machine gun crews, anyone whose primary job was something other than carrying a rifle. The M1 1903. A 4 Springfield was the standard sniper rifle of the United States Army. The Marine Corps in the early Pacific carried the M1 1903. So the popular picture of an entire American army uniformly armed with Garands is true for European theatre rifle squads from late 1943 onward, but not before. and not everywhere. In airborne units, where weight and bulk mattered, paratroopers often dropped with M1 carbines and switched to Garands or Thompsons after landing. In tank crews, the standard sidearm was a Thompson submachine gun or a grease gun, not a rifle. A clarifying note about the so-called German shock is also necessary. German soldiers were not actually surprised that semi-automatic rifles existed. The Soviets had been issuing the SVT-40 semi-automatic rifle in mass production from 1940 onward, with limited production of the earlier SVT-38 from 1939. Total Soviet production reached around 1.5 million rifles, and Wehrmacht troops on the Eastern Front had encountered them in large numbers since the summer of 1941. What was striking about the American army was not the existence of a semi-automatic rifle. It was the universal scale of issue. The Soviets gave their semi-automatics to selected riflemen, often non-commissioned officers, and elite naval infantry units. The Americans gave them to nearly everyone. By 1944, every American rifle squad of 9 to 12 men contained 8 or 9 M1 Garands, plus a Browning automatic rifle. That was the difference. Not the technology, but the saturation of the technology. What did the Germans learn from this? The Sturmgewehr had its echoes. The intermediate cartridge concept, the select fire shoulder weapon for the average soldier, the recognition that most infantry combat happens at 300 meters or less, all of these ideas survived the war. The Soviet Mikhail Kalashnikov publicly downplayed the Sturmgewehr's influence on his own, a K-47, but the silhouette and the philosophy were unmistakable. Hugo Schmeisser, the Sturmgewehr's principal designer, was taken to the Soviet Union after the war and worked at the Izhmash factory in Izhevsk from 1946 to 1952, exactly the period when the AK-47 entered Soviet service. Whether his presence directly influenced Kalashnikov is still debated by historians, but the timing is impossible to ignore. The American military learned a different lesson. The M1 Garand was followed by the M14, formally adopted by the United States military on May 1, 1957. Essentially, a select-fire Garand, with a 20-round detachable magazine in the new 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge. The first M14 production contract went to Springfield Armory in March 1958, with the first service rifles delivered to the Army in 1959. The M14 in turn was succeeded by the M16, an assault rifle that owed its philosophical lineage to the Sturmgewehr. The MG42 lived on as the post-war MG3, in service across many NATO armies for decades. Bundeswehr troops in 1960 were carrying a recognizable descendant of the bone saw their fathers had carried in 1944. The factories that built these weapons have mostly gone. Springfield Armory was decommissioned as a federal arsenal in 1968 and is now a National Historic Site, where visitors can see Garand's bullpup prototypes, his workbench, and rows of the rifles he designed. Mauser Oberndorf, the heart of German rifle production, was occupied by French forces on April 20, 1945, and dismantled. The Walther factory at Zella Mehlis, in Thuringia, was captured by American forces in April 1945 and later transferred to the Soviet zone, where it was dismantled and removed. The Buchenwald concentration camp, where slave laborers built Gustloff Gewehr 43s, is now a memorial. Visitors there walk through the same gates the prisoners passed through, knowing that some of them spent their last months machining rifle parts for an army that was about to be destroyed. The rifles themselves still surface in surprising places. The civilian marksmanship program in the United States continues to sell surplus Garands to qualified American civilians more than 70 years after the war ended. American collectors hunt down original Springfield production examples by serial number ranges, paying premium prices for early examples with their original wood and parkerized finish intact. The Cody Firearms Museum, the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia, the Springfield Armory National Historic Site, and the National World War II Museum in New Orleans all hold significant collections. The Imperial War Museum in London and the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden display Karabiner, 98Ks, Gewehr 43s, and Sturmgewehrs side by side, an arrangement that lets the visitor see, in a single glass case, the entire arc of this story. There is a quieter ending to the story too. John Garand spent the years after his retirement living modestly in Springfield. He had never made $1 from his rifle. He had never sought publicity. He once said that the only reward he had ever wanted was to know his rifle had served the country well. The men who carried the German rifles, the ones who trudged east into Russia in 1941 and west into the Ardennes in 1944, mostly never wrote books. They lived out their lives in Hamburg and Munich and small villages in Saxony, raising families in a country that had to be rebuilt from rubble. A few wrote memoirs, most did not. Their voices are mostly silent now. The veterans who could still tell the story in detail are almost all gone. There is a deeper lesson here that goes beyond rifles. The American small arms triumph was an industrial triumph, made possible by typewriter factories and jukebox factories and steering gear plants converting overnight to weapons production. It was made possible by an Army Ordnance Department that placed educational orders with private companies in 1939, before the war reached American soil, so that those companies would know how to build rifles when the orders came. It was made possible by a strategic decision, taken years earlier, to standardize on a single primary cartridge and a small handful of weapons that all used it. The German experience was the opposite. Brilliant individual designs, extraordinary engineering, but no equivalent strategic foresight, and an industrial base that could not absorb the demands placed on it. The Karabiner 98K was a more refined weapon than any single American rifle. The Sturmgewehr was a more advanced weapon than the Garand, on its own technical merits. But brilliance, scattered across many programs, in many calibers, with declining raw materials and rising bombing damage, could not match disciplined simplicity in vast numbers. The German soldier who could not believe how few standard guns America used was reacting to something he could not see in any single firefight. He was reacting to a strategic decision made years before the war, in a quiet machine shop in Massachusetts, by a man who had never worn a uniform. John Garand built one rifle, and the country built it by the millions. That, more than any single quote or any single battle, is the answer to the question this story began with. The Germans could not believe how few standard guns America used, because the few that America used were enough. There is one final irony that deserves to be told. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, hundreds of thousands of Karabiner 98Ks were collected, tagged, and warehoused by Allied occupation forces. Many of them were eventually given to other governments. Czechoslovakia inherited the Brno factory and continued to produce rifles based on the same pattern. Norway converted captured Karabiner 98K rifles to fire the American .30-06 round and kept them in Home Guard service for decades. Israel received tens of thousands and used them in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, with the Czech-Israeli arms contract of January 1948, delivering several thousand rifles to a country fighting for its existence. Yugoslavia kept theirs in arsenals, and some surfaced again in the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. The bolt-action rifle that had defined the Wehrmacht's infantry for a decade kept fighting under other flags long after the country that built it had ceased to exist. The M1 Garand, by contrast, stayed largely in American hands until it was replaced by the M14, then sold off as surplus to American civilians and to Allied governments around the world. The two rifles took different paths into history because they had been built for different countries, in different ways, with different industrial logics behind them. One country had built a few standard weapons in vast numbers. The other had built a vast number of weapons in too few standardized lots. One country had asked its workers and its engineers and its planners to do the same thing, the same way, 10 million times. The other had asked its workers and its engineers and its planners to do many different things, in many different places, while the bombs fell. The first approach was less glamorous. It was also what won. If this story added something to your understanding of the Second World War, take a moment to think of the men on both sides who actually carried these weapons through the snow and the mud and the smoke. The Wehrmacht infantryman with his Karabiner 98K, fighting a war his country could not win. The American GI with his Garand, often a teenager from a town he had never expected to leave. They were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were young men, given different rifles, sent to fight each other across a continent. The story of those rifles is the story of how nations chose, and how those choices shaped what young men were able to do, and what they were not able to do, in the worst hours of their lives. Their voices fade with each passing year. The rifles remain. So do the questions. and so does the long, sober reckoning with what one country built and what another country could not.